Today, our first screening from our page, Voyages into the Past, Otit Probaho. Let me tell you something about this initiative we took some days past. So, Voyages in the Past is an independent student-led initiative embarking upon a journey moving beyond the epistemological violences and conflict of disciplines. It is important to identify a world beyond spatial boundaries, beyond rigid notions of identities. Paradoxically, several binaries often tried to monopolize the idea of history and human existence. Thus, the past has been abruptly reconstructed. History is also facing systematic distortion. Thus, it is important to historicize the past as the future seems blurry and the self in continual crisis. It is also important to identify a space and thereby strive to practice and contextualize the initiative upon the paradigms of the present time. We do intend to reflect upon such aspirations. The world is now collapsing as well as rebuilding itself. The phases of a pandemic crisis thus restricts our approach to online interaction. We also look forward towards seminars and symposiums and publication of various sorts, from blog writing to compilation and preservation of the already delivered lectures. We are fortunate enough to have with us today Professor Harbans Mukhia. He has been guiding us from the beginning of the initiative, and although he does not need much introduction, Professor Harbans Mukhia is an eminent historian who specializes in history of medieval India. He taught history at the Delhi University for more than 10 years and Jawaharlal Nehru University for more than 30 years. In this long career, he has also been associated with a number of institutions, including the British Academy, International Institution for Asian Studies, and EHESS Paris. Apart from co-editing several volumes, he has authored The Mughals of India in 2004, Perspectives on Indian History in 1993, and The Historians and Historiography During the Reign of Akbar in 1976. Among their others, he co-founder of the Medieval History Journal. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Shivangi. First of all, it's wonderful. I greatly appreciate the initiative that young students like you are taking around the country to bring history onto the public domain, and to I appreciate your commitment to the discipline of history. As you were saying, Shivangi, the discipline is under a great cloud these days, on WhatsApp University, on social media, on TV channels, and so on, where it's being distorted all the time. So it's great to see that young students, energetic students like you, all of you, and not only in Kolkata but everywhere, they are taking the initiative to retain the discipline as it is. So I greatly appreciate this effort, and I'm very happy to participate in this effort of yours. Now, the today's theme is, as you know, the past and future of this tripartite division of history into ancient, medieval, and modern. Now, let me start by making first important points, 2 points. One, that this notion, this tripartite division of history has a very brief history. It's not, it's only in from about 18th century onwards that we begin to, late 17th century onwards, we begin to hear of this ancient, medieval, and modern division of historical time. Prior to that, uh, there was consciousness of the difference between past and present. Surely, uh, the consciousness is there in all civilizations, but there is no division of historical time, or there is no periodization of history prior to that. So the first important point about that I like to make about it is that this division has two specificities. One, its spatial specificity, sorry, that it originated in Europe, and its temporal specificity that it originated towards the end of the 17th century but began to get popularized from the 18th century onwards. So these two, spatial and temporal specificities, European origin, European regional, or if you like provincial origin, and this temporal bracket. This is the first important point I like to make. There was a notion of modern. The term modern is used in Europe in the 5th or 6th century AD, but this term is used it doesn't have any value in it. It's used to describe the present. It's a synonymous for the present, to distinguish it from the past. Uh, there was a consciousness of chronology, of course, everywhere, but there is no periodization of history. So this term modern, or other terms like hal in Arabic terminology, or adatan in Sanskrit, Valmiki Sanskrit, the term adatan occurs. Uh, 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 but there is no value attached to it. No? It's just a descriptive term, present versus the past, or present as distinct from the past. Value came to be attached to it in Europe after the post-Renaissance, and particularly post-Enlightenment period. What is the value that I'm talking of? The value is that, and this is the second important point I'm making, is that Europe first creates a self-image of itself as rational in the post-Renaissance and post-Enlightenment period, rational, which leads to science, technology, development, and so on and so forth. So Europe is becoming or creating its self-image of being of rationality, of being rational in this period, and therefore modern in this period. So the notion of modernity, equivalent of rationality and so on and so forth, that is a creation in the post-Enlightenment period. Now, once this self-image of modernity or rationality is created, or let me put it the other way around, the image of rationality and its equivalent modernity is created, then it creates its other, as it were. It creates the image of what is not rational, what is irrational, what is superstitious, namely medieval. So medieval is the other of medieval is not what it is. We don't know what medieval is. All that we know about medieval is that is unmodern. It's not modern. Therefore, an antiquity or ancient or antiquity is the kind of created as a prototype of rationality that Europe began to be proud of. So that medieval and ancient are the derivatives of modern. They don't have their own identity. They are only described or qualified in relation to modernity. So medieval, as I said, is unmodern. All that is unmodern is medieval. It's a pejorative term. It's like feudal. It's a pejorative term. It's a derisive term. It's a term to tell you all that is bad, all that is irrational, all that is bad, and that's how it is still being used, isn't it? When we describe somebody who is talking nonsense or who is not talking rationally, we say, "Oh, how medieval his mindset is." So the term medieval was created as an afterthought, as a derivative of modern, or also antiquity, but medieval. I'm emphasizing here, so that they have no identity of their own. They are seen only in relation to the modern. And interestingly, these terms medieval and feudal, etc., they were created. They came into usage in about the 18th century, even later late 18th century, when the so-called medieval and feudal periods had suffered a demise, had already ended. Only then the terms came into being. So that emphasizes the fact that they didn't have an identity of their own. They were not given an identity of their own. So we get to hear this tripartite division, ancient, medieval, and modern, from about the 18th century onwards. Though it was formally created in 1688 by a German historian, Cellarius, in 1688, but it got into usage about the 18th century. Now, from about the 18th century onwards, Europe began to expand into the rest of the world, as we know. In the footsteps of first trade, then arms, then conquest and governance, its concepts also began to spread out to the rest of the world. So the question, why is Europe the site of origin, and why this period, 18th century onwards, the period of this this tripartite division, ancient, medieval, and modern? Why? Why not elsewhere? Nowhere, either in Europe or anywhere else in the world, this historical division of time. History was known, history was being written everywhere, but not in terms of division of time, ancient, medieval, modern. So why Europe? There are, I think, two reasons for it. One is that from the 18th century onwards, the global balance of power began to shift in favor of Europe. Up to the early decades of the 18th century, most of the economic power rested with China and India, particularly in Asia. But from later part of 18th century, economic power began to shift. But more important than that, the power of conquest military power began to shift in favor of Europe, and therefore Europe began to expand into the rest of the world, and therefore 18th century is the demarcating point, and Europe is the demarcating space. And the second reason why it originated in Europe is that from about the 18th century, Europe began to get obsessed with the idea of progress, as it is known, the idea of progress. Progress, what did progress mean? My senior colleague, late Professor S. Gopal, used to tell a beautiful story on this idea of progress. He used to tell this story that in the 19th century, a British Prime Minister was on his deathbed, and he went sort of, in Professor Gopal's words, he went gaga and kept shouting on and on, up and up, on and on, up and up. This, Gopal would say, encapsulates the idea of progress. On and on, up and up. Just go on, further and further. How do you go on further and further? That is to say, you produce more, you sell more, you earn more profit. You earn more profit, invest that profit into producing more, selling more, earn more profit. So go on producing more, go on accumulating profit, and go on and on and on with that. The equivalent of capitalism. That's what capitalism does. So that this obsession with the idea of progress in terms of technological advance, in terms of more and more production, more and more profit and accumulation of profit and so on and so forth. This idea of progress was an obsession with Europe. And this idea of progress was encapsulated in terms of stages of development in history. Uh, Adam Smith was the first to think of stages of development. History has advanced through the stages of development. You know, the very notion of development then encapsulates this idea of progress that I've talked of. So you think in terms, you begin to think of all of history in terms of development or progress in the sense in which I describe it. And this stages of development theory reaches its high water mark in Marx and Engels, who gave us various very watertight stages of development: primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, which will lead on to socialism and ultimately to communism, when all stages of development will culminate in that state of communism. So each stage is very clearly marked with very clear distinctions from the past and the future. Each stage has its own watertight box, as it were, placed in a watertight box as it were. So that history now began to be looked upon, the perspective of history changed. History was so far looked upon in terms of from the past to the present. Now it began to be looked upon in an inverse direction, from the present to the past, as it were. Not formally, but in the sense of the perspective that was given to us was the perspective of modernity. How modern was Europe in 17th century or 16th century or 12th century? How much it was it progressing towards modernity? And this came to become universal attitude. Everywhere history that was studied came to be studied in terms of its relationship with modernity, its relationship with how distant it was, or how close it was to, or how was it, how progressively was it moving towards modernity, and so on and so forth. So uh, history became, as it were, a modernity became, as it were, the starting point of the study of history, the perspective of history. And this is what gave a very crucial Eurocentric perspective, which became universal. Everywhere, history began to be studied in this perspective. Now, from Europe, this tripartite division spread to the rest of the world, and with this perspective, and therefore it reinforced the European origin of this perspective, and the uh, temporal sort of bracket of this tripartite division. Everywhere you studied history in terms of these stages, and therefore you are reinforcing the perspective given to us. And I remember as a young student and a young teacher in the 1950s, slightly earlier and slightly later, there used to be heated debate in China among Chinese historians, what they called the sprouts of capitalism. Did China have the sprouts of capitalism before the Europeans, before the West dominated it? They said yes, of course it had. But colonialism came and cut out that, suppressed those sprouts of capitalism. Capitalism is modernity, naturally. So that sprouts of capitalism were not allowed to grow by colonialism. Though China had all these sprouts of capitalism, it could have grown, that's to say, it could have grown into a modern nation, a modern country, modern society on its own if colonialism had not been. Same was the discussion in India. Lot of discussion. Yes, as most historians said, yes, of course, they didn't call it the sprouts of capitalism, but the discussion was the same. Irfan Habib put a closure to this discussion with this very brilliant article in, I think, 1969, Potentialities of Capitalist Development in Mobile India, where he argued very powerfully that whether colonialism had intervened or not, India had no potentialities of capitalist development. Anyway, but whether you are on one side of the debate or the other side of the debate, and this debate also occurred in Latin America. So whether you are in one side or on one side of the debate or the other side, the terms of debate were laid down by Europe in terms of modernity, how close you were to modernity or to capital. And therefore, it was assumed that Europe has given us the modern world that we inhabit. The modern world, the modernity and the modern world that we live in has been the creation of Europe in a particular period of time. It became an objective reality, as it were, that it was a European creation in this period. Chris Bailey, in his brilliant book, Making of the Modern World, says modernity was out there. It was an objective reality for everyone to see. No dispute about it. It was just out there. So that this modernity is the crucial central entry point into the study of the past from 18th century onwards, and which is reflected in this threefold division of historical time: ancient, medieval, and modern. Excuse me. But over the past 3 or 4 decades, this central point, this central entry point, this modernity, the concept of modernity as European creation, it has in a particular time bracket, this has come under a very severe question everywhere in the world, particularly in Europe itself, but everywhere in the world. It has come to a very severe questioning everywhere. One could guess that the background to this questioning had started evolving earlier, but maybe in the last 30 or 40 years, this has become very sharp. This questioning has become very sharp. Why has it happened in the last 40 or so years? I suggest that this again takes us to the global situation. Once again, the global power relations have changed in the post-Second World War period. In the post-Second World War period, there was the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc, which was challenging the capitalist bloc, power of capitalist bloc. There were very successful anti-colonial struggles in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, everywhere. There were anti-colonial struggles which were challenging the epitome of capitalism, namely colonialism. And particularly from the 1980s onwards, the rise of Asia as an economic power is also a very substantial contribution to the changing balance of power on the global scale. And therefore, the modern world that had been out there in Chris Bailey's world was there for everyone to see. This began to be reshaped, as it were, in the last 40 or odd years. And therefore, the perspective of history also began to change. One substantial change was that one began to think not of modernity, singular, as it was given to us, but modernities, that every region has its own modernity, that there are the modernity is not an objective phenomenon, but there are subjective modernities, regional subjective modernities. Each region, each society has its own notion of modernity. And therefore, one began to speak of modernities rather than one single modernity. More important, the centrality of Europe and the time bracket, the point with which I started, that centrality of Europe as the origin of modernity and the time bracket uh, within which modernity came to evolve in Europe, these began to be questioned. I have a wonderful statement, two statements actually from a leading academic intellectual of our time, Eisenstadt. Uh, in 1966, Eisenstadt wrote, historically, modernization is a process of change towards those types of social, economic, and political systems that have developed in Western Europe and North America from the 16th century to the 19th. Very specific that these changes have developed in Western Europe and North America from 17th century to 19th century. Here, he's restating the old point. In 1998, 30 years later, he writes that there is only one modernity is a fallacy, that there are many modernities. So you can see how in these two sentences, the drastic change, overall change in the notion of modernity has evolved in the last 40 years. Therefore, now there is an increasing acceptance of the view that the world that we inhabit, the modern world that we inhabit, has been created by not by Europe alone and not by in a particular time bracket, but by contributions by all civilization and all society, and has been a continual process, not in a particular time bracket, but has been a continual process throughout history. These contributions are many and in many, many different areas. The contributions of crops, for example, and crafts, for example. Every day when we have a meal, uh, breakfast, lunch, or dinner, or any meal, we have crops in it which have originated around the world. Let me take the simplest possible uh, 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 what shall I say evening meal, not dinner but evening snack. Samosa, singara as it is called in Bengal, but samosa elsewhere. Samosa has potato in it, it has tomato in it, it has chilies in it, it's fried in a triangular shape. That's samosa. Now, as we know, potato is not an Indian crop. Chilies is not an Indian crop. Tomato is not an Indian crop. And even the triangular shape that it has acquired is not an Indian shape. It has come to us from Central Asia. Frying in this triangular shape has come to us from Central Asia. So even this little snack that we have every day or every alternate day or every other day, it has so many ingredients from rest of the world. Or any meal that you have, and you have means all of us anywhere in the world have ingredients from all over the world, crops from all over the world. And it's not in the 20th century or 19th century or 16th century. It has been happening throughout history. Or craft, or trade and transport. Harappa civilization is thrived on trade, long distance trade in precious stones and so on, and therefore transport. concepts and ideas, various kinds of concepts of ideas about everything, about the universe, about life, about society, any kind of concepts and ideas. They travel around the world. They have traveled around the world throughout history and influenced other regions where they have traveled. Or religions, how much impact do religions which have originated in different parts of the world and at different points of time, how much impact they have on the evolution of society and on the evolution of the modern world. Philosophies, technologies and terminologies, and so on and so forth. One can go on. Creation of states, wars. Think of wars, how they, what great impact wars have had on the evolution of our modern world, or arts and aesthetics, and so on and so forth. One can go on with this. The list is endless. Or think of, imagine when the wheel was invented. Uh, what a what a transformation it made to the world, this wheel. Can we think of life without wheel today in the 21st century? And how far back, uh, we probably don't even know how far back it was invented. And yet it spread throughout the world and impacted the world throughout the world and still does so. Or when the first coins were minted, the economy went into a transformation around the world bit by bit as the notion of coins or money spread out to the rest of the world. Or the concept of divine and divinity, and so on and so forth, religious doctrines. The concept of zero, Aryabhat's zero, uh, as a concept. It's not that societies didn't know the value of zero before Aryabhat told us, gave us the concept of zero. Value of zero was obviously known. Otherwise we would have to assume that nobody could count beyond 9, because as soon as you say 10, it involves a zero. So the concept of zero was not known, but the value of zero was still and used. But the concept of zero completely transformed mathematics and transformed astronomy and so on and so on and so forth. Tea, think of tea or paper. How much impact? What have these things done or gone? What have these things done to change the world once they were discovered or invented or whatever? How much they have changed the world and continue to impact the world. And they are not European invention. Not all of these are, in fact, very few of these are European inventions in a particular period. They have been invented and they have been evolving throughout history, throughout the world, and they continue to impact the modern world. So that the encompassing impact of so many things, even little things like tea and silk and paper, think of life, think of the world without these things. So that life was changing all the time under the great impact of these contributions throughout the world by different societies and different civilizations. Now, what periodization, ancient, medieval, modern does is it highlights change. Slavery to feudalism, to capitalism, to socialism, it highlights change. Very dramatic, very emphatic change from one stage of development to another. And therefore, when we are questioning the utility of periodization or notion of periodization, are we abandoning the notion of change? No, we are not abandoning the notion of change. We are in fact, in a way, seeking to redefine the notion of change, to understand change not only in dramatic terms, French Revolution changed the world. Russian Revolution changed the world. Or some big event changed the world. 1453 in France, modern period until recently used to begin in French in the history taught in France with 1453 with the fall of Constantinople to Europe. So that big events like these were uh, supposed to uh, denote the notion of change. Change has occurred. But that's not the only change which occurs. That's not the only notion of change. There is a much more significant notion of change, which is slow, which is almost imperceptible, and yet it changes. It changes society all the time. It changes economy, politics, ideas all the time. So that we should think in terms of uh, change, not not only in terms of big events like revolution, but also in the daily life, in the imperceptible moments of change, which are very, very emphatic change, uh, without which we can't do anything in life. Now, the 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 realization of change at this level uh, began to, in a way, re, re, uh, redefine the ancient, medieval, and modern periods, the watertight boxes, watertight periods, or boxes that we were talking, redefine them, or let's say dilute them a bit, when we began to realize that a period of 1000 or 1200 or 1500 years of one period, is emphasizes as if nothing had changed from one to the other. In fact, the dark ages meant nothing changed in the dark ages of medieval period. That was the implication, and yet things were changing very fast, very, very emphatically. So the realization that these are huge periods, which therefore uh, override change, which do not let change be reflected. This realization began to dilute the boxes, kite boxes that we were talking of, and we began to think of late antiquity, early medieval, late medieval, early modern, and so on and so forth. These terms began to change, uh, the well, modify uh, the 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 earlier long periods that we had got familiar with. Secondly, uh, uh, the perspective of history writing, uh, here I'm not talking of modernity versus others, but the perspective of history writing, or the themes of history writing also began to change. Most of the history writing was in terms of political, dynastic history, wars, battles, administration, etc., etc., until the 19, until the early 20th century. That was so everywhere, including in India. I was a student at Delhi University in the second half of the 1950s, and this is the kind of history that we were, as undergraduate and postgraduate students, we studied. Very boring uh, descriptions of battles and wars and accession of rulers and their deposition and so on. But history writing began to change. Study of history began to change to the social changes, economic changes, technological changes. Now it's easy to put dynastic changes and political and administrative changes into strict time brackets. On uh, this year, such and such a ruler came to the throne and he was deposed, or this dynasty replaced another dynasty, or this battle took place, etc., etc. But when you so it's easy to fix the time bracket. As I said, 1453 is the year from which demarcates in Europe, in France particularly, the medieval from the modern period. Prior to up to 1452, it was medieval. From 1453, modern began. Uh, Quite ridiculous. Or in India, I was saying I was a student in the second half of the 1950s. Uh, Ancient India began from early on Harappa culture to the James Mill had given us this tripartite division, different kind of tripartite division, Hindu, Muslim, and British period. So until about the 8th century, uh, seventh, seventh, mid 7th or 8th century, the Hindu period, then the no man's land, as it were, vacant period. Then the Muslim era began from 1000 AD with Mahmud of Ghazni or Muhammad Ghori 1200, and so on. And modern period ended with 1707. So exact dates, you could see ancient period ending and medieval beginning and medieval ending. Modern beginning. It's quite ridiculous. So when you began to study social and economic and technological history, history of technology, etc., these exact timelines, they lost their meaning because societies and economies and cultures don't change like this in a particular year. They change, and prior to that year, so they change very slowly, and they change nonetheless. So these time periods, these uh, uh, time periods of ancient, medieval, and modern began to become more and more flexible. But the tripartite division uh, still remained intact, for it indicated still it predicated history on the on the marked stages of change, very marked stages of change, whether in terms of dynasty change or change in the religion of the dynasty or change in the fortunes of a dynasty or whatever. The dynasty, the development, the stages of development, that remain. Now, the problem with these marked stages of change is that it overlooks the slow and steady but uh, encompassing change in society, economy, culture, in everything, something that I talked about a little while ago. There is, in fact, the very notion of change versus continuity or continuity versus change is a very dubious notion. Uh, this is the period of change. This is the period of prior to that is the period of continuity. It's a very dubious notion in the sense that uh, continuity and change, they are not counter, they are not counter to each other. There is a lot of continuity when things change, and there is a change, a lot of change when things appear to continue. Uh, I have a delightful remark from Mark Bloch, uh, who described the feudal age or medieval feudal age into two uh, feudal ages, the first and the second feudal age. And he said that the feudal age lived by the idea of no change, changelessness. And yet the change from first feudal age to second feudal age was such that if a visitor from one feudal age visited the region from another, his village from another feudal age, he wouldn't have been able to recognize. Such was the profundity and depth of change. So change was still occurring even when you lived by the notion of changelessness. Change was still occurring. And therefore, there is a lot of change in what appears to be continuous. And there is a lot of continuity. What even after French Revolution, there are lots of things, as Francois Fourier showed, lot of things which had not changed even after the French Revolution in France. In fact, he virtually, not in so many words, but virtually asked, was there a revolution in 1789? In France, so much of pre-revolutionary structures had continued, even after the revolution. Or Russian Revolution, everything changed. And yet, 70 years down the line, one realized that so many pre-revolutionary structures in Russia, the Soviet Union, had remained intact and were still operative and reasserted themselves 70 years later. So, continuity and change, they are not dichotomous. They are not dichotomous to each other. There is a lot of one which subsists in the other. And therefore, the stages of development overlooks these subtle changes, these gradual changes, which are continually taking place in society. Now, for example, can we? I talked of tea and paper, for example, which have enormously changed life everywhere in the world and continues. Can we put this change in a bracket, temporal bracket? This change occurred from this period to this period, or tea, or gun, or cotton, the use of cotton. Can we put all this, which is so much a part of our everyday life, every time, all the time? Can we put it in a temporal bracket, or the use of guns, or the use of religions, or the coming of religions? Can we put it in the particular bracket, time bracket, that religions changed this from this time to onwards, and then it sort of disappeared? No, we obviously can't. These are continual processes. All of these are, whether in the terms of ideas or religions or material things like cotton and guns and tea and so on and so forth. These are continual changes which are taking place all the time, and therefore they can't be compressed into into temporal stages or boxes. Now, there is one question which remains. Many questions remain, but I'll take up one question. Is that am I not abandoning the notion that or questioning the notion that some changes occur at a faster pace in a particular period of time than in other periods of time? There are periods of time when the pace of change quickens very fast, and then there are periods when the pace of change is slow. And therefore, the notion of periodization emphasizes early modern or early modern, emphasizes this notion of the pace of change from medieval and so on and so forth, or modern emphasizes the notion of change from that period. Now, I would like to say that the pace of change, the fast or slow pace of change, is also a cumulative effect of the preceding history. As we grow, as our change grows in any sphere, its pace of change also grows accordingly. The change that we are witnessing today in the last 30, 40, 50 years is unprecedented. Unprecedented, not only the change, but the pace of change that is occurring wouldn't have occurred in the last 200 years. And yet it has occurred because of the last 200 years change, which has prepared this pace of change now that we are occurring, now that we are witnessing. So that the pace of change is also a function of history, function of the preceding history, which doesn't occur all by itself. And therefore, the pace of change as a demarcating line, as a line of demarcation from one period to another, itself ought to be seen in its historical context in terms of the preceding preparation of this pace of change, rather than on its own standing. And second question, it has been suggested that, we can still continue to use these terms: ancient, medieval, modern, pre-modern, early modern, etc., etc., minus the value that is attached. Can we not continue to do that? We don't abide by the values that are embedded, but we still continue to change them to describe the distinction from one period to another. I'm not sure whether it can be done that, whether it can be divested of the values that are attached, that are embedded in. One, as soon as you mention the term modern, whether it's early modern or late modern or medieval, immediately you have a value. You understand it in terms of a value. And therefore, I can't see it's getting divested of that value uh, in and secondly, if you divest it of the value, uh, medieval period is it's not a backward period, but medieval period is from this century to this century. Uh, uh, then it comes to it is the equivalent of the temporal back bracket. That's to say, you use the very period 12, India from 12th century to 16th century. Instead of saying India from in medieval India, you say India from 12th century to 16th century or 17th century or whatever. India from 6th century BC to 6th century AD, rather than ancient India or Professor Romila Thapar never uses the term ancient. It's very interesting. She always uses the term early India. She understands the meaning, the value embedded in the meaning embedded in ancient. So it comes to using centuries and decades and centuries and millennia. So why not use the same centuries and decades and millennia rather than these terms ancient, medieval, and modern? Now, finally, I also promised to talk of the future of this tripartite division. We live in the modern era par excellence, surely. 19th, 20th, 18th, 19th, certainly 19th, 20th, 21st century. Look at, try to imagine India, or sorry, the rest of the world. Try to imagine the world, today's world, or 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st century world, in the 23rd or 24th century. How will the 23rd or 24th century look upon the world of modern world of ours, this modern world of ours? How will it look upon? Very unlikely that it will call it modern. Why? Because the meaning of modern would have changed then. They would probably look upon us as very backward people in terms of technology and so on and so forth. Probably the categories which comprise modernity, the elements which comprise modernity would have undergone a drastic change in the next century or 2 centuries or 3 centuries. And therefore, it's very unlikely that they'll call this period a modern period. So a new meaning of the term modern evolved, and they will certainly not call it medieval and ancient anyway. So that what is likely to happen, nobody can say what will happen, but what is likely to happen is that new categories of analysis will have evolved by then. Let me go back to the first point I made, the opening remark that I made, that this tripartite division is a European invention in a particular period of time. And any creation, or let me say creation, European creation in the particular period of time, 1890. Any creation in a given context is a transient creation. it has a particular context of its evolution, and then it gets outdated, and then new categories of analysis begin to take its shape, take its place. Therefore, certainly new categories other than ancient, medieval, and modern would have been very likely to have arisen in the 22nd or 23rd century. These would have become transient. These would have become outdated in the 23rd, 21st, 24th century. What are the new categories that will evolve? Uh, we let's leave it to the future to decide what the new categories will be. Who can say? Who can ever say? Who can ever imagine what the new categories will be? But we are certain that in a world where most probably uh, uh, artificial intelligence and digital the dominance of digital life would have become the norm then, and not the sort of daily uh, routine of production and reproduction and produce more and sell more and earn more. Very unlikely that will be the characteristic of the 23rd or 24th century. It will be a new, different kind of life altogether. And therefore, the very term of ancient, medieval, and modern would have lost their meaning altogether. Therefore, let the future decide how they will characterize their own modernity or so-called modernity, and how they will characterize our modernity and our medieval past and ancient past. Let them decide instead of us deciding for them. But I think it's very likely that they will decide. Meanwhile, what we can do as of now is to prepare ourselves for the transition, that to question the received wisdom we have with us, and to prepare ourselves for a new thinking, for a not new so much, for a rethinking of these categories that which are already being qualified. That itself means rethinking, but possibly a, to prepare ourselves for a future in which these categories would become irrelevant anyway. Many thanks for bearing with me for so long. These are all random thoughts. There is no definitiveness in them. There can't be in history. It can only be tentative and suggestive. Many thanks. Yes.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful talk on the topic the past and future of ancient, medieval, and modern. That is the tripartite division of periodization in history. More, I think this is one of the most debated topic of Indian historiography and beyond.
Mm.
You have actually opened our perspective or reminded us to look the future beyond the existing trends or interests of Eurocentric notions on the economy, society, and culture of any geographical space. So it's actually very nice to have you today, sir. You have given us immense support, guidance, and advice. You have been with us throughout the initiative, throughout the beginning of the initiative. You have uh, we are just thankful to you so much. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much, sir.
Shivangi, and your friends, and
We are
everybody else to me.
we are looking forward to have you on the next sessions, maybe, because it's really
Sure.
wonderful to have you today. Thank you so much.
There are no questions. I can't see any questions.
Uh,
Maybe they are not. There aren't any
um,
questions. You can't see them either. Okay, that's all right.
So,
That's all right
so
if they
there
are not
are
present.
some question, but uh, so there is a particular question
Hmm.
from the audience section, that is um, um, about, which is about the question about the
Which,
impact of
what's
colonial
the
and
question?
imperialist historiography. The question is, could you kindly tell us about the impact of colonial and imperialist historiography in establishing stage-wise periodization, especially in Orientalism historiography?
Well, in a way, I was talking of that. You call it imperialist and colonialist and so on. I mean, this tripartite division came before imperialism came and colonialism came. But then it also, in a way, connected to that. The question is right. In a way, it got connected to imperialism, and because my emphasis on its European origin in the so-called early modern period, uh, in a way, points towards and the emphasis on stages of development. Europe was advancing fast, and so on and so forth. Which led to colonialism, imperialism, so on and so forth. So their notion of history as the idea of progress means progress means economic progress, technological progress, progress of exploitation, and so on and so forth of resources, their own resources and the resources of the rest of the world. This idea of progress, idea of stages of development leads to colonialism and leads to imperialism. So that connection is there, and therefore we in a way imbibed that historiography. All of us, not India, everywhere in the world. Uh, 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 this tripartite division of history came to Japan towards the end of the 19th century, to China also in the 19th century, to the rest of the world, to the Arab Muslim world. So it spread out to the rest of the world. So all of the world got impacted by this notion of stages of development, which is, as the questioner, whoever he or she is, has in a way rightly drawn a connection between imperialism, colonialism, and this kind of history. So yes, there is a connection. Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Sir, there are
That,
some more questions.
okay.
The next question is from Mohan Rawat. His question is, how you define early historical period and early medieval period in Indian context? We know the timeline, but would like to learn from you about it. Please address.
Well, early period, I mean, at one time, ancient India began with the Aryans, and right up to Harsha, or slightly post Harsha period, and then a century, 1.5, 2 centuries were left vacant. It was nobody's history. Uh, then, with the coming of Harappa culture, it began from Harappa, and then right up to Harsha, 8th century, around 8th century or so. And then medieval period. I've said all that. Medieval period, following James Mill's definition, medieval period began with Muslim rule in India, either from 1000 AD, Mahmud of Ghazni's invasion, or Muhammad Ghori's Delhi Sultanate, 1206 AD or 1200 AD, and so on. But then new the notion of early medieval began to arise when social formations began to be investigated rather than these dynastic changes. See? So that R.S. Sharma, particular, the term early medieval is used in different contexts. One, A.B. Pandey has used, historian A.B. Pandey used early medieval to indicate the Delhi Sultanate. Uh, but then a different meaning, which is the same. You early medieval and late. He didn't call Mughals the late medieval because he didn't write on the Mughals, but he wrote on the Delhi Sultanate, so he called it early medieval. But that's not the meaning of early medieval. The meaning of early medieval was impact. Professor R.S. Sharma's notion of early medieval is when, according to him, feudalism began to evolve in India. In fact, for him, feudalism didn't evolve in India. It was in a way imposed from above in India, with which I have very, very big differences, which I have put on record. So I don't want to go into that. But nonetheless, he changed the meaning of early medieval by shifting the focus from dynastic history to social and economic history. Uh, and therefore, it's there that early medieval, the period of coinciding with the period of, in his view, and the view of those who hold on to the notion of Indian feudalism, uh, which also is under questioning by many historians. Uh, but this period, early medieval, coincides with the period of feudalism prior to the 11th century or so. So, and then medieval period begins, uh, which again, there is a problem there. See, early medieval period emphasizes the socio-economic changes. Okay, accepted for the sake of it. But then medieval period, then once again you go back to when does the medieval period begin? It begins with the establishment of Delhi Sultanate and so on. So you go back to dynastic history. So that if it was early medieval period is the period of feudalism where socio-economic changes took place, and medieval period is the period of either development of that feudalism or development of or some other structure of society and economy, then they would have early medieval would have fitted in very well with medieval, but it doesn't fit in as of now. It doesn't fit in very well with medieval. So early medieval in terms of socio-economic changes and medieval in terms of dynastic changes, they don't fit in very well with it. But that's the meaning that Professor R.S. Sharma particularly gave to the notion of early medieval. Yes. What else?
Sir, it is from Kirti Tripathi. She is saying, "Respected sir, thank you for this excellent talk. I have one question. If we say that during the 1950s, the idea of history was only seen in terms of politics, pacts, kings, dynasties, etc., then should not we make the same statement about the present when our stance towards history writing is only anti-colonial? Hasn't it become the only way of doing history?"
Well, one, you are right. What's her name? Kirti. Yes, Kirti. You are right
Kriti
to
Pooja.
some. Yes, you are right to some extent. In the post-independence period, partly it was the same colonial history that we carried on with, same periodization and so on so forth we carried on in. Then it began to change. The colonial uh, postulates of history began to be questioned by Indian historians, very substantially began to be questioned. And therefore, history was decolonized very substantially uh, particularly in the 60s onwards, late 50s and 60s onwards. D.D. Koshambi, introduction to the to the an introduction to the study of Indian history. That was a demar- demarcating line as it, and history began to be completely different from what it was until then. So it began a kind of new phase in history writing when it was not anti-colonial per se. It was anti-colonial because it was different, but it was not anti-colonial anymore. It was Marxist kind of socio-economic history, which began to evolve. And today, from 1980s onwards, another threshold has been called. Marxist history writing crossed a threshold, but and lasted till 1970s. From 1980s onwards, ever new themes, and today in the 21st century, marvelous new themes are being investigated by young historians. Wonderful work is being done on uh, themes which have nothing to do with, which are not either Marxist history or colonial or anti-colonial history, which are totally independent of these kinds of dominant paradigms, Marxist or colonial, and so on. So new themes of on ecology, on gender, on household, you know, on interpersonal relations, on concepts of time, on concepts of history, and so on and so forth. So these are no longer anti-colonial themes. They were in the 19 early years of independence, but no longer. Right.
So, sir, the next question is from Shombit Roy Choudhury. His question is, how has history writing changed or transformed in India with the advent of different schools of historiography?
Well, different. It's wonderful that there are different schools of historiography now,
Yes.
which uh, which enrich history. You know, the great beauty of history, of which in my generation was completely deprived. We had only one sort of version of history, and not only in India, everywhere else in the world. Uh, the great beauty of history is the plurality of its of its uh, of its meanings. You see, so so now the plurality of meanings, plurality of versions, plurality of perspectives of history have emerged now, and therefore its real beauty is coming to the. So all of these schools, different schools, except the school which wants to throw us back into the James Mill kind of history, Hindu versus Muslim, and so on and so forth. That's absurd, absurd. And no historian practices, no student of history, even at an undergraduate level like you, or postgraduate, or research, or teachers, or professional historians. No historian does that kind of history anymore. It used to be done until the 1950s, but no longer. So that, but the present regime wants to push us back into that kind of history through WhatsApp University and through TV channels and so on and so forth. But historians don't take that very seriously. It's only the WhatsApp University readers take that seriously. But I've 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 been speaking to university and college students even now, and I find very, to my great delight, that they don't take that kind of history very, because history as a discipline has gone far beyond that kind of Hindu versus Muslim kind of history, James Mill kind of history. So, so except for that kind of history, there is a great diversity of visions of history, of perspectives of history, of themes of history. Above all, the various beautiful themes of history. Uh, which uh, which are being undertaken by young students. Yes. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
So
Thank
there
you.
is four more questions, then we are over. So
Uh,
there are four more questions. The next
okay.
question is from Alok Tandon.
Okay.
His question is not scientific rationality behind advent of modernity in Europe not available to other societies till late? Sorry.
Well, one, both scientific and rationality, they are they have been invested with a European sort of European. Uh, they have been invested with European specificity. These are given to us by Europe, rationality and science. No, rationality has different meanings in different contexts. Rationality, and all societies have had rationality and their own sciences. See, uh, so many inventions that I mentioned, some of them uh, have occurred. Technological and scientific inventions have occurred. Scientific concepts and technological inventions have occurred outside of Europe and throughout history. China, the Arab world, uh, India. Uh, so many concepts have evolved. Concept of zero, I just mentioned. The astounding achievements in the study of astronomy in India and in the Arab world, and so on and so forth. So the assumption that this is what Europe has taught us, that science and rationality are specifically European contributions. They are not. Uh, and they are universal. The whole, and even in the evolution of European science and rationality, there are contributions from around the world. Contributions of mathematics, for example, Indian contribution, mathematics, for example, uh, Arab contribution in astronomy and in medicine, for example, and so on and so forth. Chinese contribution in so many technologies, gunpowder technology, among other things, and uh, water, sorry, paper and silk, and so on and so forth, which are the products of uh, rational minds. So it's not European. Europe has no monopoly over rationality and science. And rationality, as I said, has different meanings in different contexts. Even in a way, magic has its own rationality in the sense that I'm not saying that we should adopt magic as a rational science. What I'm saying is that when somebody goes to a magic healer, for example, for healing, rather than to a doctor, how does the magic healer heal him? No, not through medicines, but the faith that the patient has in the magic healer is that faith which gives him healing, and that is his rationality to go to magic healer. Not that the magic healing is rational, but the faith, his faith in that magic healing, that is what gives him the uh, gives him gives him the healing. So that faith also has a rationality, not blind faith, not faith in just following everything that is told to, but faith in the in the uh, in anything, in the faith in a doctor, for example. Why do you go to a particular doctor for your treatment and not to another doctor? Because you have faith in it. It's not irrational faith. It's not blind faith, but it's a faith which has meaning, which has rationality. So faith and I'm sorry, uh, rationality and science, they are no monopoly of Europe and not any particular period. Yes. What's the next question? Last question.
So, second last, is it possible to view history with the category of modern? It is from Arka Chakraborty.
Uh, with the category of modern. Well, that's what
Is
we
it?
have been. Uh, yeah.
Yes,
Is
sir.
it possible to
Uh,
read with this the category of modern?
is it possible to view history without the category of
Oh,
modern?
without the category.
Yes, sir.
No, you. what does the category of modern tell you about history? I mean, what is it that modern category of modern when you're talking of uh, astronomy, for example, where does the either you say how modern was that astronomy? That's the question that you raise. Why do you have to raise that question? How modern was that astronomy in the 6th century AD? The astronomy was a developing science or developing science in the 6th century AD, and these were its characteristics. So you give up this notion of you transporting your own assumptions about your world back into the past. You don't. You are looking for your world into the past, which is a wrong way of. It's as I said earlier. It's studying the past it's going from present to the past rather than from the past to the present. The study of history is from the past to the present, not from the present to the past. Yes, and finally,
Yeah. How can we interpret the relationship between postmodernism and literary writings? It is
oh
from
God,
Debojyoti Mondal.
I think I'll leave that question. It's a very big
So,
question, and
so there is one more question. It's the last question.
I hope
Finally,
so. Yeah.
it is from Adit Dash Gupta. His question is regarding the periodization concerning Indian history. There are several notions of periodization associated with Indian history, as you have mentioned. Have this created breaks in historiography? How, as students of history, we can address the question of tremendous disruption and distortion of historical facts associated with the notions of breaks associated with Indian history?
Well,
It's a long question.
y- yes, yes. Good question. History is a study of continuities and breaks. A point, probably the last point I made. History, continuity, and break, they are not antagonistic to each other, and yet there is a difference. When uh, when Aryabhat gives us the concept of zero, it's a break, certainly a break, very great break. It gives you a new concept. Any new concept gives you a break. When Einstein gives us the concept of relativity, it's a big break from the past concept, or for that matter, Newton or anybody else. Big break. So, but this break is in the context of continuity. You see, how did Newton, how did Einstein arrive at this theory of relativity, unless there was Newton before him? Uh, so that we have to see various various sort of studies in the break as a part of change in that continuity. That continuity is changing at a certain point through a new idea, through a new discovery, through a new invention. And yet that new invention, new discovery is part of that uh, evolving scenario, so that uh, there is no there is no there is no such break which completely breaks off from everything that happened before. Colonialism is a break in history. In colonialism, let's say, is a break in history in India. Certainly, it's a break. But colonialism was built upon, a great deal of it was built upon the existing structures. And therefore, colonialism continued with a lot that had existed earlier, continued, didn't break broke some part of continuity and continued with us other part of continuity, so that everything is both a constant and a change, both a continuity and a change. You have to see this, where the change occurs and in what context it occurs and how much of it carries the earlier one. I mentioned to you Asa Fure's question. Was there, I mean, he didn't put this question so many words, but he showed how French Revolution, which is supposed to be not only a watermark in the high watermark in the a point of change in the not only in the history of France, but not only in the history of Europe, but in the history of the world. It's a demarcating line. Everything changed after 1789, yesterday, 14th July. But Francis Fuller showed that not everything changed. Many things did not change. Some changed, others did not change. Or I gave you the example of Soviet Union. So many things changed, and some others did not change. So that things change that we see, change has to be seen in the context of continuity, and continuity which changes and changes which continue with the past. Okay, I think I
We have already headed to the end of our event. I would like
okay.
to say some words to you. That is, thank you,
Okay.
sir, for the excellent talk and addressing the questions that came from our audiences. And thank you
Okay.
again for inspiring us to give success of this lecture that is hosted by our page Voyages into the Past or Utit Prabaho. And I would like to thank our audiences also. They have done a great job questioning us
Thank
with
you.
such enthusiasm. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you to you too and to your audience. Yes, many many thanks, and wish you the best. Have you the, have the best wishes for you for the future.
Thank you so much,
Okay,
sir.
bye.
It is our first screening, guys, of our lecture series. For more updates, look forward to the page of Voyages into the Past or Otit Prabaho, and please support us and guide us if we if you want to suggest something new to do. Thank you so much.